state regulations stay fairly consistent. That is not the case with the federal government in terms of the oil and gas industry. And so we're going to take a look at some issues, some of which honestly do stay pretty constant, but others have seen significant changes in the past several years. So we'll talk about worker safety and then the environmental impacts, which are areas that the federal government has a pretty heavy hand in. So the key act is the Occupational Safety Act of 1970. And this specified federal standards for safety. About how many people die each year in the oil and gas industry. As a rule of thumb, you'll see about 100 to 150 deaths each year to people in the oil and gas industry, or more broadly, the energy industry. That sounds pretty significant, especially if you've gone on the rig visit, you've seen all the equipment around. You can imagine how easy it would be for someone to get hurt. In reality, probably 50% of those deaths are vehicle crashes. And so what's surprising to me is not how dangerous working in the oil and gas industry is, it's how safe working in the oil and gas industry is, comparatively speaking. But worker safety is important not just because the federal government says it so, and not just because I think it's important to take good care of your workers, but also it has financial rates. Companies that don't do a good job of taking care of their workers pay higher insurance, and so they also have a financial incentive as well. In terms of wildlife environmental issues, this is one where there's just not a ton of recent activity. The two key acts are the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and the Migratory Bird Act of 1918. For example, the Bird Act may require you to cover tanks of oil because oil, if the birds obviously were landed in open coverage or open storage of oil, that would affect them. And so it does drive things. One of the big questions that people ask me is, well, what about wind farms? Because they just slaughter lots of birds. And the answer is it winds its way through the courts, and you don't really see a lot of significant rulings on this. Do wind turbines kill birds? Yes, they do. Do they kill as many birds as some people allege? No, they don't. Are there sometimes difficulties with endangered species like bald eagles, killing bald eagles? Yes. So it's there, but it doesn't seem to have a significant issue. What does have a significant effect are water and air environmental issues. So the Clean Water Act of 1972 gave the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA in the United States, the authority to regulate spills and discharges. Now, into what do they regulate? Well, one of the key definitions is this idea of waters of the U.S. And that has to do with rivers, ponds, lakes. And so the definition of what constitutes the waters of the U.S. becomes a big deal because that definition establishes the boundary of what the EPA is allowed to regulate. In other words, do you have to get a permit because you're going to have a runoff into this particular body of water versus that particular body of water? During the Obama administration, they tried to expand the definition of waters of the U.S. People in the oil and gas industry were aghast because it was going to require a lot more EPA permitting for things like if you had to dig the pits for the mud and the like. When the Trump administration came in, they tried to amend the waters of the U.S. definition. Basically, they dragged their feet. And then the court stayed the implementation of the 2015 definition formally in 2021 and said that they would go back to the pre-2015 definition. And so really I'm getting myself tongue-tied here. The point is this has been litigated back and forth in the courts. Democratic administrations traditionally try to expand the role of the EPA. Republican administrations typically try to dial it back. And currently, this fall, there is before the Supreme Court, Sackett versus the EPA, that may, and I say may, actually get a court-adjudicated definition for waters of the U.S. But it's a big deal because it determines what has to be permitted, and you can imagine the cost that that drives. Also, is the Safe Water Drinking Act of 1974. Notice that all these major environmental rules came in the late 60s and early 1970s. So this also, in the mind of some people who are anti-fossil fuels, is an inroads for the EPA to regulate or to have an impact on oil and gas drilling, because they say it affects the water quality of the United States. There was a huge EPA study that was published in 2017 on the impact of fracking on safe drinking water in the United States. Very hotly fought. Now, if don't get your timing messed up, the 2017 was when the study finished, but the study was begun during the Obama administration, which was a Democratic administration, and all sides got something they were looking for and something they were disappointed in. The people who wanted the EPA to basically outlaw fracking, the findings weren't nearly as significant as they had hoped. Basically, the EPA says there is no systematic contamination of drinking water because of fracking. But, so that is what typically Republicans, conservatives wanted. The Democrats did get a bone as it went through all this public hearing about the findings, because they said, but it has the potential to create problems in the drinking water, which is true, like we talked about. If an operator doesn't do a good job of casing and cementing a well, it is possible that things could leak into the water tables, but that's only if they do a poor job of cementing and casing the well, because normally there should be no issue, which is why the EPA said we really can't find that there's been a systematic problem. Water is a big issue, but air is the big kahuna when it comes to current actions. And so I'll stop this video and start another video dedicated to air.